All right, welcome to day one of the BNEF London Summit. My name is Sanjeet Sangera. I'm the head of wind for Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And today we're going to discuss the Global Wind Energy Manifesto for COP26 that was published today by the Global Wind Energy Council. So this document lays out 8 concrete steps to move us toward a world that is more aligned with net zero. It was signed by 80 different wind energy companies and some major utilities as well. And with me, I have an esteemed panel to help have this conversation. We have Rebecca Williams, the director of COP26 for Global Wind Energy Council. We have Ben Backwell, the CEO of GWEC, and we have Morten Dyrholm, who is the chairman of GWEC and also senior vice president at Vestas. So Rebecca, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah.
If you could maybe guide us through what's in this document and what is it really asking world leaders to do?
Absolutely. So COP26 taking place in Glasgow next month absolutely has to be a watershed moment in our fight against climate change. And what we've seen so far, I think, on the world stage is a lot of positive, warm words about renewables and about action that we can take to tackle climate change and limit global warming. But actually, we're just not seeing that happen yet on the ground. We're not seeing the right policy framework in place to really tackle this climate emergency. I mean, if we look at the pledges that are on the table at the moment, they only get us to 2.4 degrees of warming. And we'll all remember that in the Paris Agreement, the agreement there is below 2 degrees with efforts to pursue 1.5 degrees. So this absolutely has to be the moment that world leaders start to get serious about tackling climate change, and particularly get serious about the opportunity that renewables provide in helping us get there. So from our perspective, from the global wind industry's perspective, we're running a coalition, and this coalition of more than 90 different organisations of the biggest wind energy companies, plus a huge network of international associations from around the world, are now joining together to really make the point that wind is the tool that has the most decarbonisation potential of any of the solutions that we've got out there. And we're here where we want to help global the world decarbonise, and we want to help global leaders get there. But we won't be able to do it alone. We need to see now a climate emergency approach to policy making to really tackle climate change. So that's what we're calling for ahead of COP26. And as you said, the manifesto sets that out in more detail in 8 key steps that will get us there.
You talk about this being the right moment. I guess the other challenge is at this moment we're also seeing a bit of a global energy crisis. We're sitting in Europe where wind output has been lower than usual, and we've actually had coal plants come online to kind of backstop the whole power system. And so in this document we're actually calling for acceleration of wind and phasing out of coal. Mm-hmm. So how do you respond to critics that say maybe the power system isn't ready for this type of acceleration at this moment?
Well, I think the fact that we are having to bring coal back online to meet this challenge at the moment just shows how outdated our wider power system is. In this manifesto, we're calling for a massive scale-up of wind. We need to scale up wind by 4 times to get to where we need to be to tackle climate change and to meet our targets. Actually, we also need to have a power system which is fit for purpose. The one we've got is outdated and is not going to be fit for the future. So actually in the manifesto, we are getting into the gritty detail of the key barriers that world leaders and governments around the world need to address in order to see this rapid scale-up of wind. And grid is absolutely one of those. So we do need a much more modern approach to how we deal with grid and to having a variable system with renewables at its heart.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, another factor that was pretty prominent in this document is permitting. So I see it get brought up a few times. And so why does permitting need to be on the agenda at COP?
Yeah, great question, because perhaps it wouldn't be the first thing that everyone might think of in terms of tackling global climate change. But actually, what we see around the world is a huge potential for wind energy. And as I just said, we need to scale up 4 times in order to meet our climate targets. But actually, the policy framework that we have at the moment is really slow, onerous, and bureaucratic, and just isn't up for this challenge. The policy framework that we have just won't get us there. So when we're talking about permitting and consenting, what we need to see is a kind of common sense approach to permitting. We want to see these really bureaucratic bottlenecks removed so that we can play our part in tackling climate change and bring those economic and social benefits that we're talking about when we're talking about wind. It's a huge opportunity for a new approach to infrastructure. And so we really need to tackle this kind of permitting challenge head on. I'll give you some examples of that as well. So if we look at some nations that we would consider to be, at the forefront, I guess, of the energy transition, or, have been very successful at deploying renewables so far. So places like Germany, we've still got, I think, 8 gigawatts of wind stuck in the pipeline in Germany, not able to get generating and help us, reduce emissions from the global power sector. If we look at a country like Scotland, who are hosting COP in a month's time, I mean, in Scottish planning applications, climate change is not a material consideration. So you can't take account of climate change in a planning inquiry in Scotland. Is that really the right approach when we need to tackle climate change? Support for renewables is sky high, and yet you're not allowed to consider that in a planning inquiry. It's absolutely ludicrous. So I think, when we're getting into the nitty-gritty of these challenges and what we need to do to tackle climate change, it is about the subjects that I've just been talking about, so permitting, grid, and also better access to markets for renewables.
Maybe one final question then. Yeah. The term just transition comes up in this document as well. And so why should business and political leaders pay attention to a just transition?
I think the opportunities that wind brings to countries around the world, are very clear. And if you look from a UK example where we're all here today, you can see the huge impact that offshore wind has made in places like Hull and Grimsby in really revitalizing those coastal communities. So I think actually at the heart of what we're talking about here, there is the opportunity to help people transition from one sector to another, and to help the global workforce really change and adapt to the new future that we're all moving towards. So this is a transition, and we also want to use the skills and experience from other sectors, the oil and gas sector being one, to help really push forward the energy transition and move there together. So that's why just transition is a really important topic in the context of this manifesto.
Yeah, offshore wind is, in a few places, it's actually revitalized the economy quite a bit, and there's a lot of potential there. Ben, so this isn't your first COP, and so I'm keen to get your comments on what can we really expect to come out of COP.
Well, I think, first of all, thanks, Sanjeev, for hosting this and for the question. I think there's really 3 main planks that are on the agenda. The first is having more ambitious nationally determined contributions, as Rebecca has referred to. And I think in a way, COP will be judged on that first plank as to whether countries actually are stepping up and making climate commitments which are consistent with the Paris Agreement. I mean, I think that's going to be the absolute #1 thing that the summit will be judged on. The second is coal phase out, which the UK government has been pushing very, very heavily. And the third one is finance for developing countries, this $100 billion a year target for finance. So I think those are the kind of 3 planks. But I think for us, as an industry, targets eventually filter down into policy and into renewable energy targets, and then that filters into the enabling framework and legislation, which are the things that we are interested in. And I think, as Rebecca said, I mean, it's really about now getting serious. And we've talked a lot, and I've been to a lot of COPs, and there's been some frustrating ones, and there's been some inspiring ones. And this one is a bit of a make or break one. So I think that's where we are.
How do you plan on using this manifesto at COP? Like, what conversations are you actually hoping to have while you're there?
So our approach really is I guess we're the people who want to talk about the practical issues that maybe a lot of people don't want to talk about, right? Because it's very easy to make kind of high level statements about things, but what we want to do is talk about, okay, how do we get this done? How do we actually build out what we're going to need to get to these kind of incredible, kind of quite ambitious targets which are needed for net zero? So I mean, this the IEA net zero by 2050 report, I mean, it identifies a power system where 70% of it will come from wind and solar by 2050. And it's actually an enormous challenge to build that amount, even if we started right now at the rhythm that we would need to get to. So it's about saying, okay, how do we actually get this done? We're talking about huge amounts, 8 terawatts of wind by 2050 to be consistent with this. And yet on the ground, things are quite slow in many places. I mean, if you look at what we did yesterday, last year, 2020 was a record year of wind installations. We had 93 gigawatts of installations around the world. Now, something like 74% of that came from China and the US, which really kind of begs the question, what was going on everywhere else in the world, right? And it's so I mean, there's it really needs to be a kind of a more consistent, kind of hands-on, practical approach. And I think, as Rebecca made a very important point, which is countries kind of act like it's business as usual, when in fact we're in a situation that is a massive challenge. So we're, if you see something like COVID, for instance, that saw governments acting in ways that were completely unprecedented. We've never seen anything like that. Well, the climate crisis requires a similar kind of approach, and we need to start now. So, I mean, very much, to go back to your question, Sanjay, very much we want to be there in the blue zone, in the negotiations, saying, okay, we all want to do this. Now, how do we do it? And a lot of what we're going to do is bilateral meetings with governments, trying to get governments to actually sign up to more practical commitments around doing more around wind and renewables.
That sounds great. I think so. This COP is unlike any other, also because of what's going on globally, right? So we're kind of stuttering out of the global pandemic, and there's been new demands on government finances. We're also seeing climate change become more center stage as a topic. So given this is the kind of the landscape of the world as we walk into COP, do you think that helps or hinders the chances of achieving what you're looking to get out of this, what you claim out of this manifesto? Does that make it easier, or does it make it harder?
Well, I think, I mean, the sense of urgency, I think, has really increased, and a lot of that has come from people, demanding change from their politicians. So everything from kind of youth movements around climate, but also generally, I think you can see in the opinion polls that people see climate change pretty much everywhere now as being a top priority. And I think before there was always the sense that it was somehow a nice to have in some way, or that it was a kind of trade-off with something else. And I don't think that's the sense anymore. There was a very large kind of global opinion poll that was done a few months ago that showed pretty uniform support for taking more decisive action across the world. So that's definitely, I think, helping us. But there's also a lot of political, disruption and noise, and the world, in a way, has become more fractious since COVID. I mean, we haven't seen the level of international cooperation around COVID that we could have hoped for, I think, as the world community. So we're really, at GWEC, I mean, it's really, really important that people can see that this is a cooperative effort, that we need collaboration, that we need governments to collaborate and cooperate with each other, and indeed with communities and stakeholders as well. So I think it's a two. On the one hand, there's a real sense of urgency, but there's also a kind of certain fractiousness that can really get in the way of negotiations. And as you've seen with the energy crisis, can we call it an energy crisis at the moment, or is it not a crisis? How are you guys calling it?
Yeah, sure. It's an energy crisis. Yeah.
Okay, so with the energy crisis of the last few weeks, there's, I mean, I've seen a fair amount of kind of opportunistic pushback to sort of say we're going too fast, or things aren't ready yet. And in fact, for me, it's the opposite. I mean, I came from a background as a journalist covering oil and gas. I mean, this for me is the exact reason why we need to move as fast as possible away from fossil fuels, because this is a crisis of volatility, volatile fossil fuels, which hold our energy system to ransom. So it's the fact that we haven't followed through, and really made the investments that we need to, that is causing this situation. But yeah, we can anticipate some opportunistic pushback, and also some opportunistic pushback from interest groups, and we're seeing that from different industries. So.
Yeah, I would agree. I see it as having one step you have 1 foot in one world and 1 foot in the other. And obviously that's going to create some challenges. And I think we need to jump in with both feet if we're really going to do this, right? So the power system has to move. So Morten, Vestas is one of the signatories of the manifesto as well. And so why is industry interested in this, and what are they looking to get out of it?
Well, thank you. I mean, on behalf of the global wind industry, there's a couple of things I want to say. One is we represent hope. Everyone's saying, you know, time for talking is over. It's time for action. That's also what we're calling for. But you know what? We've been in action mode for 40 years in this industry. You know, we have actually innovated, built, produced, installed wind turbines all across all continents, and we're doing so at scale and at a very, very cost-effective manner. And we just want to say loud and clear that we have an industry that is already working. We can already now produce the green electrons we need to decarbonize our energy sector, and we can do so at scale, at speed, and very cost efficient. So that's the one reason for why we are signatories to this, because we can easily become a doom and gloom type of conversation, but we actually represent action, and we need to install more, and we need to do more, and do so fast. The second point here is frustration. You know, we're talking so much about scaling up, but on the ground, we're not seeing the scale up. We're still seeing sort of a slow trajectory of growth, and we should be seeing a quadruple of installations very fast. But what's holding us back? It's actually simple things like permitting. Why can't we fix that? It's not that difficult. Why does it have to take 8 years to get a project in the ground? Why can't we say it has to only maximum take 2 years? You know, stuff like that. You know, it's very, very easy to fix, and very, very easy to get this industry to scale up to the level we need to get into the 1.5 degree trajectory. So it's hope, but it's also frustration.
So then what are you hoping to see accomplished at COP? What do you want to see from these agreements that are going to be signed?
I want action plans. You know, aspiratory targets are fine, but what's really needing now is the bridging that gap between those targets and what we as an industry are seeing on the ground. And that's just, you know, bureaucratic hurdles and lots of different challenges that, you know, impedes our way to scale up. And I want to see real actions to remove those challenges, because we're ready. If the signal is sent, you know, start preparing for a quadrupling, we'll do it. We've proven that again and again in the industry, we can deliver.
And you feel government intervention is a necessary step to to galvanize all this?
Not in terms of providing a lot of subsidies for the wind sector, but in terms of removing the bureaucratic challenges and obstacles in front of us of actually getting projects in the ground. It just takes too long time for a project idea to a project execution. And a lot of that has to do with government bureaucracies and the way we have organized the road to market through permitting. And we have to look at that. And that's why permitting is so essential. It's super boring, but it's one of those very, very key items we need to overcome in order to scale.
I'll ask one more question, and then I'll open it up to the room in case there's any other questions as well. So 4 times installations, that's not a small amount of growth. Is the wind industry ready to meet that challenge as well? Because if we start, you know, if we start going down this path, can we actually scale a supply chain 4x?
Yes, we can. Of course we can. I mean, we've done that many times over the four decades we've been in business. Of course, we need time to prepare our supply chains, prepare vessels for offshore and all these things. But if the right signal is sent and that now we can see a credible path to a quadrupling, of course, we will be able to meet that challenge.
Very optimistic. All right. So is there any questions here from the room? Yes.
Yes. I'm Diana Hinch from S&P Global Platts. I'm particularly interested in steel supplies, steel supply chains. What this quadrupling that you say is necessary, what will this mean for the steel industry? Steel prices are at a multi-year high. Is this, and does this have an impact on your plans? And is it consistent with ecological protection to ship enormous pieces of steel from one part of the world to another. I wonder if there's any way around that, by establishing local production of steel specifically for the wind towers. I'd just like to hear your ideas on that.
So it's, just to summarize, the question is around the implications of 4x growth on the steel industry. Morton, I don't know if would you like to start it off?
Well, I can at least say a few words on it. I think there's several aspects in this. First of all, there's a little bit of a misconception that the wind industry is just shipping around huge towers all around the world. Yes, some parts of the value chain, I like that, because we also need to ensure that what we do is cost efficient. But most of the towers actually produced fairly locally towards where the sites are. So it's not that big of an issue. Of course, we have to be mindful that there's resources going into the production of wind turbines. And we are in talks, and I know the industry and GWEC as well, we are in talks with the major tower suppliers and steel suppliers on how do we get to that trajectory of green steel that we need to. How do we get green hydrogen in as part of the production of green steel? That is really a core essence. And then we have to remember that turbines are getting bigger and more efficient. We're going to be using less towers as we scale up. It's not a quadrupling of numbers of towers, because the turbines are much more efficient than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So, but still, it is something we need to be mindful of as an industry, and you will see the industry really stepping forward on the sustainability agenda right now, also in terms of our own emissions. And I think that's needed.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Could I just follow up on that? So will you be requiring green steel or low carbon steel to build wind towers in the future, or do you just take what is available? Because I understand that there's not many producers that actually produce the type of steel that you need.
No, it is really at this point in time, you don't have the volume of green steel you need. It's still sort of a growing industry. We have, as a company, and I know many of my colleagues and the rest of the company, we've set very clear net zero targets for our own company, and that of course implies that we can also procure green steel whenever that's ready available at scale.
I think maybe just to add to what Morten's saying there, I mean, a key element of our COP campaign has been to reach out to manufacturers of green steel and try and work together to find ways to grow that industry. So I think, you know, everything Morten's saying is correct, but we also want to kind of future-proof the industry and work with other sectors in a collaborative way to really grow that industry going forwards.
Another question here. Yeah.
Yeah, Kingsman from Carbon Tracker. Can I ask you a question about capital? So there's a lot of talk in the plenary session and from the IEA, for example, about huge capital requirements. $4 trillion a year is the number that's being talked about, which I think is incorrect, incidentally, but anyway. Can you talk to us about what's holding this capital back? From what you've already said, it's not subsidy, it's not taxonomies, it's not a lack of capital, it's just policy. But maybe that's not right. If you could elaborate on that, would be very helpful.
If I could.
Yeah, Ben. Yeah.
No, thanks, Kingswell. I mean, in our experience, what's really holding things back is a lack of bankable projects or a pipeline of wind power projects around the world. Where there are projects, there's no shortage of financing. In fact, competition for projects among financial actors is actually, you know, very intense to get into projects. And that's the case in offshore wind. It's the case in most places onshore wind. If you have a project that's viable and has a route to market, you don't have any problem financing it. There are some exceptions where there's structural kind of issues around finance and very high country risk that can hold things back in some of the least developed countries, or ones where there's a kind of history of kind of financial volatility. But in general, what's holding us back is the lack of projects rather than lack of finance. And in fact, you know, as you've seen, I mean, there's so many actors that have come into this sector from the financial sector, but also now the oil and gas companies trying to spend, you know, increasing parts of their balance sheets on renewables projects. I mean, there is plenty of money, but if you don't have projects, then there's nowhere to invest that money. So that's, I mean, what really needs to change is, you know, having a route to market and being able to get a bigger pipeline of projects move through planning and to the market. And we don't have any doubt that if we can do that, the money's there. I mean, it's very different from when I got involved kind of 10 or 15 years ago, where there was a kind of feeling that, you know, wind still represented some kind of risk, technology risk. I mean, those days are gone. I mean, it's just having the projects to invest in.
Yeah, maybe if I can just come in on that, it's not a money issue anymore, really. The issue here is the things that we were talking about earlier. So, you know, permitting, but also in markets where there's kind of either implicit or explicit support for fossil fuels as part of that system. And also in some markets where you have, you know, the state utility, for instance, who is responsible for all PPAs, and you just can't kind of get a foothold in that market because of the way that market is structured. So yes, it's not a money problem. It's a kind of route through that bureaucracy problem and the things we were talking about before in terms of permitting and consenting.
All right, fantastic. So I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you very much for your time, and all the best, and very optimistic, looking forward to COP. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sanjay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.